Welcome to the Market Mystics podcast. I'm Joshua.
I'm Kim. Let's dive in. Hey guys, welcome back. Today Josh is bringing the topic. He started to explain it to me and I was like, wait. Let me hit record.
It's true. Sometimes we like pregame and we're like, what do you want to talk about? What do you want to talk about? And sometimes we end up having the whole conversation. So sometimes we're just like, let's just roll. Let's just hit the record button. So this topic is something that I know we've touched on in previous episodes. But like the question that's in my mind is like looking at the world, looking at people and wondering, why don't more people make the choices to dive in deep? And like there's 1,000 good answers, but I guess like that would just be my like question to pose to you to start off. Like what do you think it is that holds people back from taking opportunities to dive in to deeper things? Like one of our last episode talking about like the Met Gala and some of these things, like where people are starting to get fed up with surface level stuff, but that still sort of drives a lot of content, is surface level conversations, like fluffy things, I guess. So I don't know. I guess just a question to you. What do you think?
I think it could be a number of different things, but I tend to think there's a fear of the unknown. And when you get into the deep stuff, I don't think it would be that deep if everybody knew everything about it. And so I think there's a fear of the unknown. I think that there's a fear of like enduring trauma in that unknown. And I think there's also comfortability. Like I know where I am right now. I'm used to it. Even if it's bad, I'm used to it. And I don't really want to mess with anything else. What do you think?
Yeah, I think your last answer is what stands out the most to me, is just I don't want to go through what it would take to do it. You know, like we've talked in the past about the books, The Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. And that's a concept from those books where there's moments where people from villages are invited to go walk the journey with these spiritual people. And some of them just say no. Like, I've got family, I've got responsibilities. Some of them start the journey and then stop, and very few of them actually choose to go the whole way. And I do think that a big part of it is like it's a commitment. Like it's a commitment, and it can be uncomfortable. Like if your worldview starts to shift and all of a sudden the things you held true have shifted, like that can be a really uncomfortable thing to walk through, because then it sort of like shakes you to your core and you're like, okay, what is my foundation? What do I believe? If this isn't what, you know, whatever it is, it could be health, it could be politics, it could be faith, it could, like whatever it is, like any of the topics. Yeah, I just think that that's a piece of it. It's a piece of it for sure. And one thing that I'm thinking is like, how do you motivate people to do that? How do you motivate people to go through that process?
Well, I have one more thing to add, that as you were talking about that made me also wonder. And I actually wonder about this. I'm not set in stone about this, but I wonder if also there's an issue with capacity.
Mm,
Like, have you ever been to the point of overload and you just feel like you can't carry anything else?
yeah.
And so thinking about stepping into the deep is just another thing to pile on top of it. You just don't have the capacity to hold it or to deal with it or to think about it or
Yeah.
go there. I wonder that as well, you know. But steps to get people to start going there, I think, I don't know. I think it's a good question, but I'm just thinking about kind of the mystic movement in Christianity and how there's a little more momentum right now. But first, there had to be people who went before, which is a really hard journey to be on. Um, I wasn't anywhere near the front of that. uh, but I mean, even in that, I'm a little ahead of some other people I know in getting into that. And there's a lot of pushback that can happen
Mm,
when you go somewhere that other people haven't been before or where other people aren't willing to go. Um, this is funny because we just talked about this in such a positive way, like um, the collectiveness of Christianity, but also I would say there's a herd mentality. And sometimes, like, have you ever heard the analogy of the crabs and how you can't really trap one crab in a crate, but if you put multiples, they'll never get out?
mm,
And it is because if there's one, it will crawl out. If there's more than one, if one starts crawling out, the others will pull it back.
interesting.
And I think sometimes the herd mentality will do that. If the collective, if the whole is not ready to advance or break out of that actual box,
Mm,
then others will try to pull them back to where they are as well. And I think that's hard. So I think you really have to have, until it becomes a bit more normal, like to dive into the unknown, to dive into the deep, to go places that other people haven't necessarily gone yet. I think it takes also a lot of courage.
mm,
And you kind of have to be willing to do something others haven't done before and be willing to withstand the possible pushback that you would get. You might not get any, but you never know,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, I think the most like the guaranteed pushback is going to come from yourself.
No, that's true.
Like that's for sure going to happen. And then pushback from other people is the unknown.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Mm. Yeah, so there's like a second part to my thought process with this, and it's kind of like, we've made comparisons to where we want to be going as the promised land, comparisons with the Israelites leaving Egypt and going through the desert to the promised land. And so like there's part of this thought that's like, well, part of the reason that keeps people from leaving Egypt is because there's a desert in between them and the promised land. And so like that's the hard stuff we're talking about. Um, but I also heard somebody bring a different perspective on the desert recently, um, where they said like, imagine like, okay, your mind is there's millions of things going on around you every single second, and your mind is narrowing that down to a very small amount of things that it deems important enough for you to need to know every second. um, and so they brought this idea that the desert is a bit like coming in contact with more information, like so instead of being super focused on one thing, it's a bit of an expansion so that then you can narrow down again. And when I think about this, I like the first thing that comes to my mind is like the example we talk about of um, going up the mountain, getting to the top, being in oneness, and then coming back down. It's a bit kind of like that. Um, but it can be really unsettling to let go of everything that you were really hyper focused on.
Right.
And I think that like that's especially when we're talking about like personal resistance, that to me is like the biggest piece of letting go of personal resistance. And so like that can come from meditating or prayer or um you know, there's lots of things that can jolt you out of a focused spot into an expanded state. And really the benefit of that is that then you can almost choose how then you zoom back in. And so when I'm thinking about this journey, like the first thing that's important is the zoom out, or you may never even know that you're not, that there's another possibility. Like that perspective, which we talk about all the time, is so important, or you may not know there's another possibility of a way of doing things. But then after that, like then choosing how you want to re-narrow back down, because that is the important. I think if you stay in the expanded state, you lose purpose and momentum and movement. And so like it's, you almost lose thought, I guess. And so it's important to like come back in and out. And like part of me wonders, like, okay, like, you know, in the biblical story, like the Israelites are in the desert for 40 years because they're complaining and they're just walking in circles. And the whole generation that left Egypt died in the desert. And so almost a generation that was born there is what went in. And so like my thought is just this, like, how could they have done that quicker? Like what what was it? And I think it's just their perspective, right? Like the perspective of, first of all, lack. Like we're tired of this food you've given us, we're tired of this leadership, we're tired of this way we have worshiped.
Mm-hmm.
And that that thought process had to die off. Now in the Bible, it's like a literal dying off, but in I'm thinking about my own life, and like that still has to die off before I can enter the new thing, because it's keeping me focused on the old thing.
Sure. Yeah. And, I was thinking when you were talking about the expanding, but the importance of the contracting as well, it just makes me think about how this is displayed for us, and like obviously displayed for us just in humanity. Like, look at our breath. Like every breath, there's an expansion, but there's a contraction too. And both are very necessary to continue on. But I also think about the ocean and the tides and the ebb and flow of that. And it is a cycle, and it's very necessary. And sometimes I think it's funny that we might remove ourselves from like all of these patterns that the Lord set up. Like they're not actually for us to. You know what I mean? And I think you're right. But I also was thinking about how when you're trying to go into the deep, some of the things that might stop you from going further is that you're being stretched too far. And sometimes when you stretch too far, you need to backtrack a little. Like, have you ever tried to touch your toes and you go a little too far? Well, you've got to come back a bit, right? Yeah. But next time you try, you might be able to go a little further. Right. And I think there's a process, and I really think there's value in it. But I also tend to think that only you're going to know your own limitations. Well, I say you and the Lord, but I don't think that I don't know. I don't think that somebody else can really tell you how far you can go or not go. And I think that's one of those kind of shackles that religion has put on us a bit, that a lot of us are really coming out of, is the like, well, your faith has limits. Mine might not. And maybe the people in the Bible, theirs didn't, but yours does. That whole kind of paradigm that sometimes gets thrown out there. I don't even think it's intentionally, but it happens.
Mm.
And so if we can just step out of that, I think there's a lot of potential for being able to go deeper.
Yeah, one of my consistent prayers is that I would continue growing at a rate that um, doesn't destroy my body. Um, because, like you said, I think you can push yourself into places that you're not ready for. You're not strong enough to hold it. Either just the weight of it or whatever it is, like and there, like, it's interesting because I for a while had this mentality that, like, I'm covered in grace, like it's fine, I can do whatever I want to do. And then um I got to a point where I was like, yeah, I don't want to grow that way. Like, I want to grow at a pace that doesn't feel like I'm falling apart, like trying to hold things together. I want to grow. We've talked about this before, but like growing mind, soul, and body, um, like the importance of them together as one whole unit. And that's like, yeah, there's so many different ways of doing this. There's so many different ways of going on that journey. Um, and like, I just think when I think about this and I'm like, God, how come more people aren't choosing the deep? I just feel like his response is, I'm way more patient than you are. And it doesn't mean that what I'm doing is necessarily any better than what they're doing.
Right. Right. I think you're right. And I don't know. I guess maybe one of the other things that holds people back is the desire.
Mm.
You know, like I don't even know that it has to be that you're just comfortable, but is there a desire to go deeper? Or are you satisfied? And I think there is something positive to be said with satisfaction, especially with things with the Lord. You know, like, are you always left wanting? Are you always left feeling like you don't have enough or you need something else? Or are you satisfied with just having him? Which is also a really fun place to be, because that's when he blows doors wide open.
Yeah. Yeah. There's one of my favorite sayings is like, the best way to get a new car is to really, really fall in love with the car you have. Like, to
Funny.
really appreciate the car you have,
Mm-hmm.
because that opens the door for other things. And like, the example was a car, but it applies to anything. Like, if you're feeling stuck at a job, like, can you fall in love with that job and the things around it? Because that opens up opportunities for so many other things.
Yeah, I think you're right. Um, just shifting gears a little bit, you said something earlier about like making the decision to go further, and it had to do with those books, the Masters, Life and Teaching of the Masters of Far East,
Mm.
and how some people would choose to dive all the way in, and some people would choose to like know of their teachings and believe it and rely on them to do it, and others just kind of had no interest. And it made me think of another book that I kind of was reading congruently with those books. And they were like, I don't know, so starkly different for me. But there's this book that is heavy, heavy. It's by J.J. Hurtak, and it is maybe from the 70s. Did he write it in the 70s?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Something like that. And we started at the same time. And my sister did too. And I'll tell you, we're still in the middle of it. It's a couple years later.
Yeah.
But it is the only book that I've ever read that in the intro, it was like full of warnings, like, don't start reading this book if you're not ready for it. Know that if you read this book, you're not going to be able to go back. Like there were full on disclosures about like in the intro before you even start reading it. Yeah. And it was almost like it was trying to scare you away. Wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And like, it's a big book. And I think I maybe made it 15 or 20 chapters. Like I'm probably less than a quarter of the way through the book.
Oh, same. I think I want to start reading it again, but it's okay. Josh and I have been reading it together again. I mean, it's been a long time. But it's one of those that for me, I just like, I will pick it up and I'll read, and then it is heavy enough and deep enough that I need to sit with it for a while, maybe a year.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, I don't know. Everything that we read, everything that we listen to, like, should all be done with a very much so, I think, read or listened to with skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think the more that a book challenges you, like, the more that's important, but also like the more time it takes to read it. Like, I can read a fiction book that doesn't really challenge me and just, sit and speed read it. But there's a couple like nonfiction books that I want to start, but I know that it's going to be like more in-depth content, and that takes more capacity. Right. And so like I think that's exactly why we are so far, or have only gotten a teeny bit into this book, is because it requires a lot of capacity, and it requires you to constantly be going to the Lord and saying, hey, what do you think about this? Do you agree with this? What is like, is it true? Is it true? Like, is it something I need to know about? Like, because those are different things. There can be something that's true and not for you at the moment.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And that's exactly what it is. I mean, it is, at least with this one, it is almost word by word has got to be with the Lord. And it is, I mean, there's a lot of it that I come with like very strong skepticism, but I still have my ears and my eyes and really my heart open to whatever the Lord wants to show or not show with it. There's a lot of it that just like, it did not ring as truth. It didn't ring as like lies, but it also didn't stick. You know what I mean? And so when you're going through stuff like that, and you're like constantly with the Lord, like, what do you have to say about this? Is this for us? Is this not for us? Those kinds of things. I find it interesting, the stuff that will stick, because there are certainly principles in just the little bit that we've read so far that have stuck and have kind of dug in and grown roots as well. And then the Lord has expounded on and like totally confirmed as truth, and there's other parts that I wouldn't even remember in the books that I've read about, because either it wasn't for me, or I don't know, I wasn't supposed to remember it. Maybe it's not total truth that would apply to my life or my eternity. I don't know.
Yeah. I just think that, like, this conversation started by being about your personal journey and what gets it started. And like, I think having the self awareness of not just following a trend, but what you need is so important. And I think that's a big, like, to me, as I'm saying that, I'm like, man, like, how many times have I started something like all gung ho and then been like, yeah, actually, I was just following people and I don't actually want to be doing that. And
Yeah.
then that stops the growth because I didn't pick the right thing. And like, I don't think that there's like punishment for that. You just go back to where you were and you reorient, and then you decide, oh, actually, this is where I needed to be.
Right.
And then you start growing. And I think if you can stay growing in that spot, like with a clear conscience of this is where I'm supposed to be, then maybe it's not as hard. Like, it doesn't mean you won't go through hard things, but if you're where you're supposed to be, like, there's bound to be less challenges.
Right. Or at least some grace on it or some life on it, even if it's really hard stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I know there's hard stuff that is super necessary in your journey. I've gone through some stuff. I continue to go through some stuff. It's not pretty. It's not nice. It's not easy. But do I know that it's necessary? Yes. And you know what, Josh, you talk about this a lot, and it's one of my favorite things I think that you talk about, and it has to do with the refining fire and going through that in this part of eternity instead of waiting to do it later. And I mean, refining fire it doesn't even sound nice. It doesn't sound like it would feel good, and it doesn't. But is it good and necessary? And does it bring you into the next thing? Does it level you up? Does it build up your relationship with the Lord? Does it benefit you? It does, man.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a good thought. This conversation is just, I think it's one that's frequently on my mind because I think I'm often analyzing my own growth and like really considering, am I growing? Am I not growing? And there's moments where I think I'm not growing. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wait, yeah, no, I've been moving. And maybe it's just less volatile. I don't know. But I think it's just an interesting conversation. There's so much of what I feel like our podcast does for me is like help bring um, an opportunity to be self-aware, like to really think about, like, in my own life, okay, what am I going through right now? Like,
yeah. That makes sense. I think probably same for me. Again, there's a lot of this stuff that I would maybe think about and move on from, but I wouldn't necessarily dive in and have an in-depth conversation with any other person on the planet if we didn't have this platform where we just talk about this stuff. And so I don't know, that stuff is really helpful. It's good to spur one another on.
It's true. Listeners, let us know. Like, I would love to know your thoughts on what keeps you from growing, or like what motivates you to grow. Like, either one of those, I would love to hear.
Yeah. Same.
Good stuff.
Hey, really good stuff. Good question, Josh.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. We'll see you guys next time.
See ya. Hey, thanks for listening. Keep up with us along this journey by liking, subscribing, and becoming a member through YouTube.
Members get exclusive access to bonus content with our guests, deeper dives into topics, and a look into other projects. We're glad to have you here. See you next time.